right, welcome to, problem 10 from chapter 4. So I have my shell set up. So in this problem, this investment company is going to invest money for clients, either stocks, bonds, mutual funds, or just stick it in cash. So what we're obviously going to try to do is maximize the return subject to some risk. And I've got some other constraints I'll explain in just a minute. But I did want to go over this one. This constraint is not in the problem, but it is assumed because our choice variables are going to be percentages, right? We're trying to figure out what percent of a client's money should be invested in these various categories. Therefore, it's implied that we're going to have this constraint, despite the fact that it's not explicitly said in the problem. So let's get started. So obviously our parameters here are going to be the returns for all these investments. So we have 10% for stocks, 3 in bonds, 4 in mutual funds, and cash is just, of course, 1%. Since I'm doing percentages, I'll try to put this in so that you have a better idea of what's going on. Oops. Right, for now, so I'll just let each investment be 25% of my total. And then, of course, my objective function is just going to be my sum product. Right? So what I'm trying to get at is, so if I invested 25% in each of these categories, then my return over the next year would be 4.5%. Okay? All right, so the first thing I need to do, those percentages have to sum to 1. So I'm going to do that. Oh, whoa. Right, I'm going to put in a 1 for each of these parameters, equal to rats, equal to 1. Okay, and then I have the risk parameter, and the book tells you how to do this, right? It's just a weighted average of the risk that they give you times the percent that you're investing in each of these investments. So my parameters for the risk is just going to be what they gave me. So that's 0.8, that's 0.2, and then of course 0.3, and then I got 0. And that's got to be less than or equal to some number. I'll get to that when we do this. And then they give me some more constraints. So no more than 75% of the total investment may be in stocks. So stocks, right, has to be less than or equal to 0.75. Okay, and then the amount invested in mutual funds must be at least as much as that invested in bonds. So if I move the bonds over, right, I'm going to get a -1 for the bonds, a 1 for my mutual funds, and that's got to be greater than or equal to 0, right? Because once I move this B over, I've got a 0 on the right-hand side. And then finally, they give me 2 constraints for cash. So the amount of cash must be at least 10%. That's this one, right? Cash has got to be greater than or equal to 10%, but no more than 30% of the total investment. Well, that's the other side. Cash has got to be less than or equal to 0.3. So, I'm going to put a 1 here, and then greater than or equal to 0.1, and then 1, but this is less than or equal to 0.3, okay? And then, of course, I have to do my sum products here. Okay, so choice variables. Constraint parameters, hit OK, anchor, copy down. Okay, so basically, here is my problem, right? And hopefully this helps you understand why these are 1s, right? So it says stocks have to be less than or equal to 75%. So 1 times the 0.25, that is the percent that I'm putting into stocks. The same thing with this one, right? -1 times 0.25 plus 1 times 0.25 is 0. Well, 0 is equal to 0, so that's fine. And then again, same thing here, right? 1 times this percentage, that's what gives me the 2.5, right? So obviously this one is right. Right, 25% is greater than 1, less than 0.3. So we'll see if it stays at 0.25. But at any rate, That's how I came up with all these parameters and these constraints. Now what I wanted to do is the risk. So actually you get that from part A. So suppose the maximum risk value for a particular client is 0.4. All right, just type in 0.4 and voila, we are ready to solve. So solve, I want to maximize that by changing these 4 cells. And then this cell has to be equal to that one. These two have to be less than or equal to these two numbers. These two numbers have to be greater than or equal to these two. And then finally, this has got to be less than or equal to that. So hit OK. All right, got my non-negativity, linear, solve, presto. There you go. So, the rest of this, what is the optimal allocation of investment funds? That's this. So you're going to put 41% of your money in stocks, 15% in bonds, 15% mutual funds, 30% in cash. And then what is the annual rate of return and the total risk? So this, oh darn it, sorry. This is the annual rate of return. So I don't need that to be so many decimal points. Right, but how about 5.4%, right? And then the risk, right here, I am going to actually hit that total risk, right? So I'm going to earn 5.4% and have a 0.4% or a 40% risk factor, right? I am going to stretch that right up to the bounds of my risk. All right, now part B is the same thing, but now a more conservative client is 0.18. So just change this to 0.18 and then resolve it. So everything's going to stay the same now. I don't have to do anything, just hit solve. Okay, so this client who's less risky, right, is only going to put 1% in stocks, 35% bonds, 35% mutual funds, 30% cash, and of course their annual return is going to be 2.8%. Okay, so their risk went down, but so did their return. And then C, a more aggressive client has a maximum risk value of 0.7. All right, so just go here, 0.7, and then resolve it. Nothing's going to change here. Just hit solve. All right, so this individual, 75% stocks, nothing in bonds, 15% mutual funds, 10% cash. Their annual return jumps up to 8.2%. And of course, their risk, at least their risk, is a little bit less than what they're willing to tolerate at 64.5%. All right, so there's parts A, B, and C. Now D, refer to the solution for the more aggressive client in part C. Would this client be interested in having the investment advisor increase the maximum percentage allowed in stocks or decrease the requirement that the amount of cash must be at least 10%? So to do that, I need to get my sensitivity report. All right, so I got to take a look at this. Okay, so would this client be interested in having the increase the amount in stocks? So stocks. Yes, right, because for every 1% increase in the stocks, in the amount allocated to stocks, my total annual return increases by 6%, right, 0.06. So this can go up, this can go up to 0.86 or down to 0, and this shadow price would still be valid. So yes, I would like to increase the total percent that I could invest in stocks, or decrease the requirement the amount of cash must be at least 10%. So that's this one. Yes, definitely, right? Because the shadow price here is a negative 0.3. So now notice, the negative 0.3 is actually good because if I decrease that constraint, then I get a 3% increase in my return, right? That's what the negative means. So the negative says if I increase the constraint by 1%, then total return would go down 0.03, right? But if I decrease the constraint, then total return would go up. So yes, I would be interested in doing that. And yes, basically the allowable decrease is 0.1. I'd like to get rid of the cash. I can't completely get rid of stocks, right? Because my allowable increase here is only 11%. So I could take the cash constraint up to 0.86. That would be helpful. And then I'd love to get rid of this minimum cash, right? Putting at least 10% in there. Okay, so that was D. E, what is the advantage of defining the decision variables as is done in this model rather than stating the amount to be invested? Well, I think we've talked about this before. Actually, this is my preferred way to do it because, see, these percentages then apply to any amount that's going to be invested. Right? See, when you start off with like 100,000 or a million, you know, this like your sensitivity report is only valid, say, for $100,000, right? So if you have another client comes in that, you know, is very similar to the first client, but has $1 million or $10 million, you would have to redo everything. Whereas if you just do everything on percentages, the amount that they're investing is irrelevant, and all of these shadow prices would hold for every investor. So that's the advantages of doing it that way. All right, well, that's it for problem 10.